United Methodist delegates repealed the church's long-standing ban on LGBTQ clergy, allowing members of the LGBTQ community to be appointed to leadership roles within the church.
A pastor, if they presided or officiated at a same-gender loving marriage, they could be brought up on charges within the church.
The decision will now allow pastors to preside over LGBTQ weddings without penalty. It will also allow funding for gay-friendly ministries.
When did the United Methodist Church go off the rails? You're probably thinking just the other day at their national conference where they affirmed that LGBTQ people can be ordained ministers and you can do LGBT, etc. marriages. I would contest the United Methodist Church went off the rails in 1956. That was the first year they ordained women as pastors.
The United Methodist Church is now completely open to theologies that affirm both homosexuality as well as differing gender expressions. This is wildly outside of what had been expected by people who actually work in the UMC, who, in my conversations with some of them, expressed that the best case scenario would be the passing of about half of what the Progressive Caucus actually ended up being able to accomplish during this 2-week-long legislation meeting known as the United Methodist Church's General Conference. If you've been following the drama, or maybe you just saw my last video on the UMC, you know a bit about the backstory. But to summarize, the United Methodist Church has been in turmoil over this single issue of trying to reconcile LGBTQ issues with their theology and polity within the church. Although often painted by conservative evangelicals as a denomination of libtards,
violent language, threats, gestures, harassment, sexualized language, or innuendo is never allowed and will not be tolerated.
You have to give these rules to a Christian, air quotes, Christian conference. Apparently you do if you're fully woke.
The United Methodist Church in America has been one of the largest denominations by membership for a long, long time. And that means that there has always been a wide understanding of theological ideas within the church, and there's never really been a totality of political ideology on one single side of the spectrum. In fact, in 2019, a special general conference resulted in the narrow passing of what was referred to as the quote-unquote traditional plan. This plan solidified a much more conservative understanding on the issues of LGBTQ inclusion, and therefore fully enforced a ban on same-sex marriages, gay or trans clergy, and enforced a definition of homosexuality that was described by church doctrine as incompatible with Christian teaching. However, even still, the conservatives in the United Methodist Church knew that this would be an issue that would come up over and over again, and so many of them decided to ultimately leave the denomination for safer and more traditional pastures. Over the course of the last 3 years, thousands of churches left the UMC, many of them joining a newly established, more conservative denomination, the Global Methodist Church. This follows a similar pattern to other mainline Protestant churches that have become too progressive for some of their congregations. In each of these situations, the progressive caucuses within their voting bodies have sided with an inclusive view of homosexuality, and therefore that triggers a massive exodus of people and money from the denominations into more conservative versions of their mother theologies. But this change, although similar to other denominations, highlights a coming problem for the church in America as a whole. As the results piled in from the UMC's General Conference, there was also an interesting moment where the church ultimately found itself in a position to close off the escape routes for so many conservative churches that were still looking to disaffiliate from the denomination. During the vote on that legislation, there was a woman that stood up and she said something interesting.
I speak in favor of disaffiliation. I'm very nervous and very scared because I want a place for our churches with conservative traditional values to go peacefully. I don't want our churches to be caught up in the court systems. I am traditional, and I have loved being a United Methodist. But with the values and with what has been passed to this point on marriage being between one man and one woman, and on human sexuality, I disagree, and I support the churches back home that are also conservative.
And this mindset is pretty sad to me. Realistically, for the UMC to have so many thousands of churches leave ultimately tells us that the conservative opinion about social issues in this church is essentially that of a crybaby snowflake. If they are in the minority, even though they technically weren't back in 2019, then they just go off and they quit the church and they pout and they sulk. This attitude is un-Christ-like, and it's certainly not in line with any understanding of theology that allows for both strong agreement in essential doctrines while also allowing for disagreement in non-essential practices. An attitude that, by the way, progressive members of this lady's own church have been suffering through themselves for the past 30 years as they fought to change the system from within. So while I would say that these comments are problematic, and they're also symptomatic of a general misunderstanding of what it means to be a Christian, I don't actually blame her that much. You see, the church in America has segmented itself into multiple camps now. You have, on the one hand, a fundamentalist evangelical side of the church, with all of its scriptural literalism and its political conservatism.
You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. I don't care how mad that makes you. You get pissed off as you want to. You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. They are God-denying demons that butcher babies and hate this nation.
And then on the other side of the same religion in the same country, you have a mainline progressive church, which boasts large, inclusive traditions of welcoming social change and effectively ministering to a modern culture.
We need to see the imago Dei, the image of God in each person, not just in the people who look like us, who talk like us, who think like us, who love like us, who believe like us.
These two sides are in direct opposition of one another in ideology, but they also happen to be representing the exact same religious principles. And sure, you can argue that any understanding of scripture between the one side that welcomes gay people and the other side which can't even agree that the earth wasn't created in 6 literal days are so drastically different in polity and doctrine that they might be too far apart. But that doesn't change the fact that on paper, these two flavors of Christianity have much more in common than they do things different. Each of these sides also does have a lot of righteous animosity for one another. After all, there are a lot of reasons from the perspective of each own side to tell them that their opposites are damaging the reputation of what they see to be an authentic methodology of Christian expression and doctrine.
And so I believe with the actions that this General Conference has taken, I think it really sets us up to be able to move into a space where we can talk about our opportunities to expand evangelism exponentially. And yes, I want to reclaim evangelism. I want to reclaim evangelical. I want to reclaim, our opportunity to name who we are and who we intend to be as United Methodists and move out of the space, get off the defensive, right, and get on offense.
And so the overarching theme or narrative from both sides becomes, we are Christians, but not like those Christians, we are real Christians. But that seems to sort of alienate anyone and everyone that would like to exist as a church for people in the middle, someone that exists in the tension between two arguments. Now, I am one of the people that speaks fairly loudly and regularly on the progressive side of that argument. In fact, I put a video on pause that I've been working on for quite some time to talk about all the problems with right-wing Christian nationalism so that I can make this video that you're watching right now. So obviously, I agree that there are a lot of serious issues with the conservative fundamentalist church in America. But I find myself feeling a little bit hesitant to truly celebrate this change in the UMC. It's not that I don't think these changes are good or I disagree with the doctrine, but more so, I'm seeing a trend take place online wherein there is a lot of resentment coming from both the conservative Methodists that are feeling left behind as well as the progressive Methodists that are not terribly shy about rubbing those changes in the faces of people who think differently than them. The whole church has an obligation to be a place for every person on the planet. There is not one single person in existence that is not a recipient of God's grace and God's love. That means that I am fully accepting of people in the LGBTQ community, and I welcome them into my church on a regular basis. Not to change them, but to love them as they are, because that is what I believe Jesus calls us to. I also, though, have to reckon my understanding of faith with the fact that there are a handful of people in my church that also disagree with me on the issue of homosexuality and the inclusion of people that are non-binary or transgendered. There are people who woefully lament the direction of the church to be more accepting, yet they still feel that there is a place for them to minister to others in spite of this. And it's my job to pastor those types of people just as much as it is my job to pastor the gay couple that comes and sits next to them. We have a real dilemma in American Christianity, and it all stems from division. I admit that it may seem like I am not all that helpful in this regard, as I regularly am here to lambast conservative shenanigans. And, by the way, I'm not apologizing for that attitude or communication either, because there are a lot of places online in which you can find a right-wing Christian understanding of the faith. So I'm happy to be a lesser voice to an opposing view. It's part of my personal beliefs, and I pretty much refuse to shut up about those. But I also believe that the church is a place that must be above the fray of political division and reckless hatred, which means that we must then find ways to be a home for people who do not just love like we do, and also for those that love differently than us, and even when that means people who love others that we struggle to love, or people who have views that we are less tolerant of.
We have to own and name why we want to build a church together, what type of church we want to be, and how we're going to live into who we say we want to be together. I don't think we have to have the exact same values. We don't all have to believe in the same thing, but we do have to have the same mission and the same direction. Maybe we'll take different paths to get there, but are we working towards liberation? Are we working towards health? Are we working towards unity of some sort that makes this earth look less like hell and more like heaven?
I am never going to say that we should allow for bigotry within the church, obviously. And like I said, Christian nationalism, or fundamentalism in general, needs to be called out as incompatible with Christian ideas and theology. But I will also not stop anyone from coming here and asking questions in good faith, nor will I be looking for any ways to expel people who disagree with my theological takes. It's actually a little known fact that I have never banned a single person from participating or commenting on this channel. I've only removed people who use slurs or who are certainly spam bots. I do this because I don't believe in turning away opinions just because they don't agree with me. And just like within the boundaries of my own ministry and church, I refuse to turn people away for any reasons that do not essentially amount to abuse. So the question from all of this becomes, will the church continue to drive itself more and more apart from one another for politically derived reasons? Or will the church return to being more unified? There's something awfully ironic reading about all of these churches that are leaving the United Methodist Church, as it seems as though they've forgotten who they really are. And we cannot allow ourselves to all become so similarly divisive. What I see from the conservative church is a considerable amount of time spent isolating itself from the world and harboring an incestuous relationship with the truth, as if the real truth about Christianity can only come from within. That's not very Christ-like, and it cuts off every possible influence regardless if it happens to be good or bad. The danger we've set ourselves up for is that the progressive mainline churches could become quite similarly irrelevant. They could drive out all of those that disagree with them on the non-essentials. They could end up making themselves a bastion of inclusivity at the expense of forgetting their tradition and their understanding of theology, because what they'll be doing is leaving behind people, even though that's antithetical to their stated goal. I'm certainly not one of those people that thinks that any cultural impact made on the church is always going to be a negative thing. And we definitely must find ways to allow the church to remain flexible in order to address the ever-changing world. But we also must seek out Christ above all else. And doing that means making a space for all people, even those who make us a little uncomfortable. Now is a great time for the UMC Church to take a chance and take positive steps in more than one direction all at the same time. They can effectively choose to not only reach out to those people who have been ostracized by the church for so long and the LGBTQ community, but they can also remember to look backwards. And they can refuse to leave behind those people that feel like they disagree with the decisions made by the denomination in the name of that inclusivity. If both sides of the political ideology that separates the church in the U.S. become too segregated, then eventually neither will exist. The conservative church will cease to exist because they essentially age out of relevance, or just die off. And likewise, the progressive church will cease to exist if all they can offer is a place of inclusivity for some rather than for all. And there must be something about the church that is radically different than the way of the world. And I would argue that the difference involves a radical love and acceptance for all people. If the church refuses to maintain a stance of neutrality and love for all people, regardless of their personal theologies, then eventually both sides will suffer. Maybe there will be some third version of the church that is more concerned with centrality, or maybe it will result in the death of the church as a whole. I don't really know. But I do know that if the church wants to survive, then we need as many people involved as possible. And while I'm personally invested in continuing to extend an olive branch to those progressively minded people in the world that need to know that there is a safe place for them, I also want those people to know that there is also a place for their family and their friends to experience the love of God, even if those people think completely differently than me. And to gather all of those people, drastically different thinking from one another, under the same roof, well, I think that might be true Christianity. But I want to know what you guys think. Can Christianity truly be for everyone? And can the church truly speak to all people? Or do you think that one side will essentially have to just beat the other into submission? I'm thinking that brutal competition might not be the ultimate answer here. But regardless of what you think about me or anyone else, I hope you found something useful here. Subscribe if you want to hear from a more progressive voice that accepts all opinions as at least partially valid. And most importantly, remember that I love you all.